Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. My name is Avery, and I hope you can't hear my laundry going in the background. You know what? It needed to be done. I was so behind on it. I was like, okay, let's just get this going. And then I thought about it, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to do a podcast episode, so I don't think you can hear it, though. Anyways, I hope you're excited for today's episode. This is episode 38, and we're going to be talking about the Hidden Window Mystery. I'm really excited to talk about this book today with you all. I've got my sweet tea right here next to me. I've got my notes, and I'm all ready to go. So this is the 34th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1956. And I know I've said this about several of the Nancy Drew books, but I didn't remember anything about this one. I didn't remember really reading it as a kid. I know I did, and I know there's obviously a hidden window at some point in this mystery, is what I was thinking before I read it. But I feel like the first 10 books to me are so classic, and I remembered a lot of elements of those, but everything past that has been, honestly, a mystery. So we've got a couple book covers to discuss today. And the original cover from 1956, we've got Nancy in this red robe. It actually looks a lot like a bathrobe that I used to have. It was so cozy. But she is out on the grounds of this estate, and we see this huge peacock in the foreground, and Nancy's shining her flashlight on it, and this man just kind of creeping around in the background behind the trees. And the second book cover from the revised edition, this is actually one of my favorite book covers. It's very blue, it's very moody looking, but we have Nancy, and she's wearing a blue shirt, and she's got her hair, it just looks really cute, honestly. And she's very strawberry blonde here, but in the background we have the hidden window, which it's got a knight on a horse holding a shield. I feel like this book cover looks like an Enya album cover. Does anyone know who Enya is? Because Enya was when I discovered her when I was in the 8th grade, when most people were into Limp Bizkit, I was like, oh, I love this artist. She lives in a castle in Ireland with her cats. This woman is living the life. But anyway, this book cover looks a lot like her Shepherd Moon's album cover. I actually really enjoy both of these book covers, and if you're having trouble picturing them just from my odd descriptions, you can check them out on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast. I love to post these on Wednesdays before the episodes air, and you can also find some really fun Nancy Drew content. Just saying. So I came up with a funny cover spoof for this book, and I used the original cover because, it has Nancy in a bathrobe with a peacock. It's giving so much right now. So I just came up with the cover spoof of What the Flock. Because honestly, looking at that book cover, I was like, I have so many questions right now. Why are you running out around in the middle of the night chasing a peacock? I need answers. But as far as a cover rating goes, I gave both of these book covers 5 magnifying glasses. I think they're really good covers, and they really accurately represent the book. So now I'm going to go ahead and read the cast of characters that we're dealing with in the Hidden Window Mystery. So first up, we have Sir Richard Greystone, who is like a lord from the UK, and he is the one that is searching for this hidden window. We have Nancy's mailman, Mr. Ritter. There is a Miss Dondo, who I just put nasty neighbor in quotations, and she has a brother named Alonzo Rugby. There's also Susan Carr, who is Nancy's cousin, and her husband is also in this book. His name is Cliff. And they have a cook named Anna. There's a Sheila Patterson and her daughter Annette. Sheila is an actress. She is very dramatic. And Mark Bradshaw, who is a stained glass guy in Virginia. And then last but not least, there's a Mr. Honcho, who is a neighbor of the Carrs, and Luke Seeney, who is a guy who occasionally works for Mr. Honcho and also has a crush on Annette. So now that we have our cast of characters down, we'll go ahead and jump into the synopsis for this book. Our mystery starts with Nancy and Hannah hearing a crash on the front porch and finding their mailman has fallen. Nancy collects the mail, and Mr. Ritter tells her a man in England, Sir Richard Greystone, has offered a reward for anyone who can find a mysterious stained glass window. Not long after, Miss Dondo, a nasty neighbor, accuses Mr. Ritter of losing a letter with $100. Nancy finds proof the woman is lying and begins to research the stained glass window, deciding to pay a visit to her cousin, Susan Carr, in Virginia. Before Nancy can even leave River Heights, strange things happen and Susan has ran off the road. Her car is also tampered with at the repair shop and there's a second crash. When Susan finally recovers, she and her husband tell Nancy about a weird estate with high walls owned by a Mr. Honcho where screams can be heard. Nancy also begins to take stained window classes with Mark Bradshaw and meets Miss Dondo's brother, Alonzo Rugby, his assistant, who wants Nancy to leave. Nancy is then asked to stay at Sheila and Annette Patterson's home as they're worried that it's haunted. They encounter peacocks, a ghostly specter, and find some hidden passageways. Nancy is able to finally locate the real stained glass window and prove that Alonzo is trying to pass off a fake one, and the mystery is solved. So, the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with for this book that kind of just ties it all together is Long Lost Window from England Found in Virginia Manor, thanks to Teen Sleuth. So, I took down several fun notes for this mystery of Nancy's, so we'll go ahead and jump right into them. So, right off the bat, Hannah mentions the strong April winds, so we know what time of year it is. I love when we get these little context clues in the Nancy Drew books because otherwise we're just kind of making an educated guess because, Nancy never ages, and sometimes the only clues that we get that time is passing is when the seasons change. So, it's sometime in the spring. So, this next note that I wrote down, Nancy and Hannah hear something crash out on the porch, and it's their mailman. He's fallen over, and so Nancy runs out there to help collect the mail because it's blowing around. And they help Mr. Ritter up, and he says that he spotted a contest in this magazine about finding a stained glass window, and he tells Nancy, I know you're good at solving mysteries. You should enter this. You would probably find it and probably win the reward money. But about that time, the Drews' new neighbor, Miss Dondo, comes over, and she just starts screaming about this lost letter with money in it. And after she leaves, Nancy, Bess, and George go around looking to see if they can find it because they don't want Mr. Ritter to get in trouble, but they overhear Miss Dondo saying that she was trying to scam Mr. Ritter out of money. So she's a completely horrible person, and turns out her brother, Alonzo Rugby, who we meet in a minute, is also an awful person. But I was just like, who does that? Who just tries to blame their problems on someone else? I mean, their elderly mailman, don't like her. So my next note is Bess says that peacocks are unlucky, and when a peacock feather blows through the window, she screams. And Hannah apparently dropped it, and it blew into the room, and she says they were Nancy's grandmother's and in the attic. She went up there to get them because Nancy's talking about the stained glass window, which apparently has peacocks in its design. So I thought it was funny that Bess was that terrified. Bess can be a little bit superstitious in these books, and sometimes even Hannah can be. So my next note is Nancy has a cousin named Susan Carr, and she and Bess and George decide to visit her in Charlottesville, Virginia, but as they're getting ready to leave, they get a telegram from Susan telling them not to come, but it's a hoax. So this happens so much, and usually they can figure it out pretty quickly because they can call the person, but occasionally, in this day and time of no cell phones, the person may not be home, and luckily, they're able to prove that it's a hoax pretty quickly. But they get to Virginia and they see on the news that Susan was run off the road by another car. I was like, okay, wow, this is breaking news apparently. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's horrible that Susan had a wreck, but it's what are the odds that they just turn on the TV and then it's that's my cousin. So Nancy, Bess, and George go straight to the hospital, and they see Susan and go get her car from the repair shop, but the steering doesn't work, and Nancy crashes. So there's a lot of car crashes, in the first few pages of this book. It was a bit traumatizing. I mean, Susan was in 2 car crashes within 10 or 15 pages, and I'm just was Harriet Stratmeyer Adams just gunning for her? Because, wow. The next note that I took down is when the cars mentioned screaming behind the walls of Mr. Honcho's estate, I knew it was going to be peacocks. I mean, it was kind of a dead giveaway seeing that peacock on the first cover. But if you've ever heard a peacock scream, it's an interesting sound. You should look it up on YouTube. I've actually encountered peacocks in my own life. I actually pet sit full time for a living. That's what I do. But I was staying at this farm one time, and the owners had told me, yeah, there's some peacocks that are down the road. You probably won't even see them. And I went out on the upper balcony of their house on the porch, and I was drinking my coffee one morning, and I felt like something was watching me. And I slowly turned my head, and up on the roof of their house, I kid you not, was this beautiful peacock, and it was just staring at me. It was the coolest, most random experience that I've ever had, but it was just like the feathers just are that beautiful blue and green iridescent, and I like ran to get my phone and was trying to get a picture of it, but it like jumped off the house and like ran across the yard, and it was making all this noise, and it was so cool. I'm a lot like Nancy. I have such a weird job. So the next note that I took down is Nancy goes to Mark Bradshaw, who is a local stained glass expert, and she asks him if he has seen the article in the magazine about the reward for this window, and he says no, but later she sees the magazine in his shop, so she knows he's lying. And this reminded me so much of Message in a Haunted Mansion. If you know, you know. Gumbo Foo. It's just like this sinking feeling that you're like, I know this person's lying to me, but they don't know that I know. It's just, it adds an extra layer to this mystery. So there is a man that scares the car's housekeeper, Anna. He's caught staring in the window at her, and Nancy goes outside to investigate and finds a tube of paint and realizes the man must be an artist. But someone knocks her out, and when she comes to, the tube is gone, so there goes her evidence. But she takes a tracing of the footprint. So the next day, Nancy goes back to Bradshaw's studio, and Alonzo Rugby is working there as his assistant, Miss Dondo's brother. And Nancy asks if she can take classes from him. And while she's going about and learning some things about stained glass, she's also sizing up the men's feet to see if they're a match for the intruder. I thought this whole scene was very funny because Nancy has apparently judged the size of the footprint against her own. And so she reaches forward to shake hands with Bradshaw, and she's like looking at her foot and looking at his feet, and it's just funny. This next note that I took down is just a saying, which I thought was kind of funny. Ferret out the facts. I was like, that's fun to say, but I believe it's Nancy that says this. She's like, I need to ferret out the facts for this mystery. Sometimes it seems like Nancy is trying to herd a bunch of ferrets when it comes to her mysteries, like, you know, just chasing these suspects and getting into all these crazy situations. So Nancy can't actually measure Alonzo's footprint to see if it matches the intruder's while he's watching her, so she drops her compact in some bushes as she's leaving the studio so she has a reason to come back later, which I was like, that's pretty smart. In case somebody catches her, she can just be like, oh, I came back because I was looking for this. But she catches Alonzo stealing her peacock sketch when she goes back at night. And it's the same one that he threw in the fireplace, and he made a big deal out of it. He was like, you'll never be an artist. And then here he is stealing it. So Nancy's like, he must have some interest in this missing window. So Nancy didn't go back to the studio alone. She actually went with Ned because he's conveniently in town. But Nancy gets treed by this dog that actually turns out to belong to Mark Bradshaw. And he comes outside of his house, which is apparently right next door to the studio, and it's very embarrassing for Nancy. She's like, oh, I got caught. And so she tries to explain to Mark. She's like, I was here trying to find my compact. And he's very, like, cold towards her. But she doesn't tell him about Alonzo breaking into his studio. I think the reason she doesn't is because she wants to keep a closer eye on him herself, and she's not sure if they're in cahoots. But I was like, that could have cleared things up. So the next thing that I made a note of is there's some guy named Paul Staunton, and he tries to cozy up to Nancy at the car's party that they throw. And then there's this actress named Sheila Patterson who tells Nancy that this peacock keeps showing up in her yard. And from Sheila's description, she sounds a lot like Cruella de Vil because she has like black hair with a white streak in front and winged eyebrows. But she convinces Nancy, Bess, and George to stay at her home and find out if it's haunted. So we have like all these little sub-mysteries within this big mystery. So this is pretty crazy, though. The Pattersons, their estate that they live on, this is probably the first time that this has been mentioned in any Nancy Drew book that I can remember, but they say that those buildings were slave quarters. They outright say it. And I mean, this story takes place in Virginia, so it is kind of the southern part of the United States. So it's an older estate, and that would have been the case. I just appreciate that they mention it because, it's a part of history, unfortunately, but it's like this is how we learn from history. So Nancy hears a noise in the middle of the night, and everyone goes up to the attic at the Pattersons' estate, and Bess sees someone that's dressed like a ghost. And Nancy and George fall through a trap door, and they end up under the house somewhere where George falls in a well, and then they come out through the pantry. This part was so scary to me because not only did Nancy and George fall down this chute and go down this slide, but then they're in their pajamas and George falls in this well, and you don't know how deep the water is. You don't know what's in it, and it's pitch black, and then they're crawling along this dirt tunnel, so they're covered in mud. It's just creepy. So after they get out of that situation, they all clean themselves up and go to bed, but the next night they hear peacocks outside, and Nancy and George chase after this intruder and the peacock, and they get sprayed in the face with a hose. But the intruder basically led them back to Mr. Honcho's property, so they know that there's a connection. So this is the part of the story when Luke Sini comes into the picture, and he likes Annette, Sheila's daughter, and he keeps asking her out on a date, and she keeps turning him down. But Nancy tells Annette to invite him over because she's pretty sure that he was the intruder. So they show him around the attic where the trap door was, and he jumps off of it like he's really sketchy and is jumpy. So they prove that he was the ghost that was in the attic, the one that Bess saw, and they know that he pulled the switch that caused Nancy and George to go down the chute. So he admits to wanting to find the window and collect the reward money, but he does apologize, and he convinces Mr. Honcho to open his home for Garden Week. So basically the Carrs were asking Nancy to see if they could figure out why Mr. Honcho had closed his home to visitors. So she's at least solved that part of the mystery. She solved what the screaming is. It's the peacocks, and she's convinced Mr. Honcho to open his home back up. But we have to talk a second about what Luke was wearing on the bottom of his shoes. So when Nancy was looking around the property after the intruder got away, she finds all these little peacock claw marks. Well, Luke was apparently, he had fashioned these fake peacock claws, shaped the same exact way, and was wearing them on the bottom of his shoes. I was like, what on earth? Now, the next note that I took down is the estate that the Pattersons own is called Ivy Hall, and while they're distracted and gone, I think they're at Garden Week, they come back to find that the walls have been hacked apart, with a saw or a hatchet or something, and then someone stole the girls' lingerie. I was like, okay, that's really weird, and we never really get an explanation for that. It's really weird, and Nancy speculates, well, maybe it's Alonzo Rugby, and he's just stealing lingerie for his sister, which I was like, first of all, ew, and second of all, it's just it's disgusting no matter what way you look at it. I was just like, that is so strange. My next note is Nancy, Bess, and George sink a canoe because we had to have a boating accident in this one. I don't know what we're actually up to right now. I think we're up to 10 boating accidents now, which is crazy. Also, I don't know when I'll release it, but I fully intend to do a bonus episode just on Nancy's near-death accidents and mishaps because they're too crazy. So the last note that I took down is Nancy finds the window between two walls in Ivy Hall, and they go to find Alonzo Rugby, and they find this imitation window that he's made, and he's trying to pass it off as the genuine thing. And Miss Dondo and another man tie them up, but they eventually escape, and they tell Lord Greystone the truth and unite him with his family's window. And this is so funny, but the name Greystone has been so familiar to me this whole episode. I think I was getting it confused with Grey Skull, which is isn't that the castle in He-Man? I don't know. I have the most random thoughts while podcasting. So the next segment of this podcast is what I like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and Hannah wasn't around for this mystery, but Susan and Cliff apparently served squab, which I think is a type of bird, corn pudding, sweet potatoes, and biscuits. That sounds like a pretty good Virginia home-cooked meal. Now, as for the things that I said that Nancy could add to her resume, I said that she is a stained glass window apprentice because she takes classes with Mark and learns how to sketch out a design for a stained glass window, and she's a shoe size expert. She's spend so much of this book like measuring other people's shoes. Now we're going to jump into the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about the hidden window mystery. So I really liked the fact that we got to learn about stained glass and how to make it. There was quite a few pages dedicated just to how people sketch out a design and how they actually make the centerpieces. And I thought that this book also had a really cohesive story, and I love that there were secret passages. I love when these books have mentioning of secret passages, but the well in that one was really creepy. And the only thing that I didn't like about this mystery was Miss Dondo. That's all I wrote down. I was just like, she's such an awful person, trying to scam people out of money. And then, like, what is up with the lingerie thing? Like, did she actually ask her brother to steal that? Or was it just like he just did it? It's just so weird. But I didn't like Miss Dondo. But as far as giving the hidden window mystery a rating, I gave this book 4 magnifying glasses because it was a very good book. It was cohesive, it made sense, the villains were good, and I liked that we found the window in the end, which it's Nancy Drew. Of course she's gonna find the thing and solve the mystery. So yeah, this concludes today's episode for the hidden window mystery. I hope you all liked it, and if you want to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I would really appreciate it. So for next week's episode, we're going to be discussing the haunted showboat. So if you like swamp people and failed engagements and pirate treasure, then you'll probably like this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.